Nobody bid on the weathered ferry house, and small wonder, for the building had stood empty on the bank of the Canal River for the better part of 11 years, its shutters hanging crooked, its chimney cracked clean through, when Willa Bracken, 45 years old and reduced to $11 and a carpetbag, stepped forward at the county auction in the river town of Millrace Landing, West Virginia, in the autumn of 1889, and offered the whole of what she had left in the world for it. She had been cast out only that spring, when her late husband's ferry partner, a broad, genial man named Elam Tuck, produced a dissolution paper bearing what he swore was her husband's signature, one that stripped her of any claim to the ferry line the two men had run together for 20 years and left her, a childless widow with no trade of her own recorded anywhere but her husband's ledgers, standing on the landing with nothing but a carpetbag and whatever coin she had managed to hide from Elam's creditors before they came for the house. She bought the old ferry house because it was cheap and because it was shelter and because, she told herself, laughing a little bitterly at her own foolishness, a woman with $11 could hardly afford to be particular. She did not know that sealed above her head, tucked into the ceiling rafters where no auctioneer had thought to look, was a letter that had waited more than 40 years to be found, one that would clear a good man's ruined name, unearth a fund meant to protect the poorest boatman on that river, and finally call to account the family that had built its fortune on a theft nobody in Millrace Landing had ever quite dared to name aloud. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Willa Bracken. If you have ever been handed the smallest, most unwanted thing left on the table and found, against all expectation, that it was exactly what you needed, tell us in the comments, because we think you will understand Willa's story better than most. Before we begin, if you love powerful stories of forgotten heroes, hidden family secrets, and remarkable moments from history, be sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We share new stories that inspire, surprise, and remind us that the past still has so much to teach us. Now, settle in as we uncover another unforgettable journey. Willa had grown up on the water, the only daughter of a boat carpenter named Amos Calloway, who built and repaired the flatboats and skiffs that worked the upper reaches of the canal, and who raised his daughter, in the absence of any sons and in defiance of what most of Millrace Landing considered proper, to understand wood and water with the same careful attention most fathers reserved for teaching a boy. Amos had a particular talent, well known up and down that stretch of river, for looking at a hull that seemed sound to any ordinary eye and finding, with nothing more than his palm laid flat against the planking, the soft give of wrought working invisibly beneath a coat of fresh paint, or the telltale unevenness of a repair made hastily and hidden well. Water finds every weakness eventually, Amos used to tell her, guiding her small hand along a seam of caulking so she could feel for herself the difference between wood that had been properly fitted and wood that had only been made to look that way. And so does trouble, if you give it time enough. Your job is to find the soft place before the river does, because the river's always patient, and it always wins in the end. Willa took this teaching in the unhurried way a child takes in anything repeated often enough to become simply how the world worked, and it would be many years before she understood that her father had given her something considerably larger than a carpenter's trick, an instinct for pressing gently against the surface of any claim, any story, any official-looking paper, to feel for the soft place beneath. It was not only wood that Amos taught his daughter to read carefully. He had spent his whole working life among the rivermen and ferry operators of that stretch of the canal, men who lived hard, uncertain lives, often injured or drowned in the ordinary course of their work, and he had watched, over the decades, as an informal arrangement grew up among the boatmen themselves, a shared fund, contributed to by every waterman who could spare a coin from a good run, meant to catch the widows and orphans and injured men that the river inevitably produced. Amos himself had once been kept from real hardship by such a fund, after a falling timber crushed 2 fingers on his left hand and left him unable to work for the better part of a season, and he spoke of it to Willa with a reverence he reserved for almost nothing else. A fund like that only works, he told her, so long as the man holding it remembers whose money it truly is. The day he starts thinking of it as his own to lend or spend as he pleases, it's already gone, even if the ledger still says the numbers there. Willa absorbed this lesson too, without fully grasping, in her contented girlhood, how directly it would one day apply to her own life. She married at 24 to a ferryman named Thaddeus Bracken, a steady, good-humored man who operated the Millrace Landing ferry crossing in partnership with his lifelong friend Elam Tuck, the two of them having inherited the business jointly from Elam's father some years before Willa arrived in town. Thaddeus was not a wealthy man, for a ferry crossing on a modest river town rarely made anyone rich, but the partnership was steady and well-regarded, and for 20 years Willa kept her husband's half of the ferry's books with the same careful attention her father had taught her to bring to a hull's seams, catching, more than once, small discrepancies in the toll receipts that Elam's own bookkeeping had missed or glossed over. Discrepancies Thaddeus always attributed to his partner's cheerful carelessness with figures rather than anything more troubling. Willa was not so certain, in her own private thoughts, that carelessness was the whole explanation, but Thaddeus trusted his old friend completely, and Willa, for the sake of her marriage and the partnership both, kept her quieter suspicions to herself. What she carried forward from all those years, more than any specific skill with a ledger or a hull seam, was her father's old conviction, confirmed 100 times over in her own quiet observations of the ferry's accounts, that a fund or a trust is only as honest as the hand that holds it. That trouble reveals itself eventually to anyone patient enough to keep pressing gently at the surface of a story that does not quite sit right, and that the softest place in any arrangement is very often exactly the place everyone else has agreed, out of long habit or long friendship, not to look. She did not know, in those years of quiet contentment beside the river, how soon and how completely she would need that conviction, or how entirely it would one day be the only thing she had left. The fall came, as it so often does, close on the heels of a grief that had not yet finished settling. Thaddeus died in the winter of 1888, his heart failing suddenly one evening as he walked home from the landing, leaving Willa a widow of 44 with, she believed, a rightful half-interest in a ferry business that had supported them comfortably for 2 decades. She had not accounted for how thoroughly Elam Tuck's affection for his old friend could curdle, once that friend was no longer present to soften his partner's ambitions into something considerably less generous toward the friend's widow. Within 3 months of the funeral, Elam produced before the county clerk a dissolution agreement, dated some 6 years earlier, purportedly signed by Thaddeus, transferring Thaddeus's full interest in the ferry business to Elam alone in exchange for a cash settlement Elam claimed had been paid privately and never recorded. A document that would have required Thaddeus to have quietly sold away half his family's living without ever once mentioning it to the wife, who kept his very books. Willa knew, with the same certainty her father's hand would have known a soft plank by feel alone, that the document was false, for she had kept those books herself for 20 years, and no such settlement had ever crossed the household's accounts, and Thaddeus had never, in the whole of their marriage, kept a secret from her worth so much as a nickel, let alone half a business. But her certainty, once again, weighed nothing against a signature and a lifelong friend's confident, grieving testimony that he was only, reluctantly, enforcing an agreement his dear departed partner had insisted upon years before. The circuit judge, who had known Elam Tuck's family in Millrace Landing for 3 generations and had met the outsider Willa only after her marriage, found the document persuasive enough, and Willa was given 45 days to vacate the modest house that had come with her husband's share of the business. She spent those 45 days doing everything her father's old instincts told her to do. She searched every trunk and drawer for some record of her own that might contradict Elam's dissolution paper and found nothing, for a forgery careful enough leaves no trace of the truth it replaces. She asked the other boatmen and ferry hands who had known Thaddeus for years whether any of them recalled him ever mentioning such a settlement, and found only uneasy silence, for Elam Tuck controlled the only ferry crossing for many miles, and no waterman wanted to risk his livelihood contradicting the man who now owned it outright. She wrote to a cousin of Thaddeus's in Charleston asking whether he knew of any such agreement, and received a reply expressing sympathy, but no useful information at all. On the 44th day, having exhausted every path she could think to try, Willa packed what little she could carry into a single carpet bag, including her father's old carpenter's level, which she had kept all these years for no reason she could have named except that it had been his. and walked into Millrace Landing proper with $11 to her name and nowhere at all to go. It was pure chance, or perhaps not entirely chance, that brought her to the county courthouse steps on the very day an unrelated tax auction was being held to clear several long-neglected properties from the rolls, among them a weathered, long-abandoned building the older residents still called the Old Ferry House, though it had not served that purpose in over 40 years, having stood empty and slowly failing at the river's edge since well before Willa herself had ever come to Millrace Landing. The building had originally housed the crossing's very first ferry keeper, a man named Obadiah Marsh, who had built and operated the original Millrace Landing ferry back in the 1840s before disappearing from the town's history under circumstances nobody, now living, seemed entirely able or willing to explain, the crossing itself having passed, in the years after Marsh's departure, into the hands of Elam Tuck's grandfather and eventually down to Elam himself. The old ferry house had simply been left to rot once a newer keeper's cottage was built closer to the modern landing, its roof sagging, its chimney cracked, its interior thick with the dust and leavings of 40 years of disuse. And when the auctioneer read out the parcel, the small crowd gathered mostly for other lots offered nothing but a ripple of indifferent amusement, for nobody imagined the ruin was worth troubling over. Willa, standing at the back of that crowd with her carpetbag and her father's old level and $11 that represented the entire remaining sum of her married life, felt something stir that she could not entirely have explained to anyone watching. Perhaps only the plain, practical recognition that a roof, however ruined, was more than she otherwise had. Or perhaps something closer to her father's own old instinct that a thing everyone in a hurry called worthless deserved, at the very least, one careful hand pressed against its surface before being written off entirely. When the bidding, such as it was, opened and closed at $8 with no other interest at all, Willa heard her own voice offer $9, and no one bothered to raise her, and the auctioneer, looking faintly sorry for the widow he plainly recognized from the recent talk around town, took her money and handed over the deed without further comment. He walked down to the old ferry house that same afternoon, in the low gold light of a fading autumn day, prepared to find little more than a leaking roof and four walls between herself and the coming winter, which by itself would have justified the $9 easily enough. The building was indeed in poor repair, its floorboards soft in places, its single chimney cracked from foundation to cap, but the frame itself, built by a man who had evidently understood good timber the way her own father had, remained soundly joined despite 4 decades of neglect, and Willa found herself moving through the small rooms with her father's old level in hand almost without deciding to, checking sills and joists out of a habit too deep to set aside, even in her own exhaustion and grief. It was in the smallest of the building's 2 rooms, the one that had evidently served as Obadiah Marsh's own sleeping quarters, that Willa's level, laid flat against the exposed ceiling rafters while she assessed whether the roof above could be trusted through a hard winter, told her something her eyes alone had missed. One short section of rafter, tucked close against the chimney's masonry, sat very slightly proud of its neighbors, as though something had been fitted into the space behind it, that the original builder had never intended anyone to notice. Her father's voice returned to her plainly in that moment. Water finds every weakness eventually, and so does trouble if you give it time enough, and your job is to find the soft place before the river does. Willa worked the loose board free with the flat of a chisel she found among the ferry house's abandoned tools and reached into the narrow cavity behind it and drew out a small, tightly wrapped oilskin packet that had evidently sat undisturbed in that dry, sheltered space for a great many years. She sat on the floor of that small room in the last of the daylight and unwrapped it with hands that had gone unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with cold, and found inside a single letter, its paper brittle and yellowed, but its careful, sloping hand still entirely legible, dated the spring of 1847 and addressed to Miss Verity Marsh, care of whatever household might eventually receive it. She might, on any less desperate night, have set it respectfully aside as none of her business, a stranger's private correspondence found by accident in a house she happened now to own. But something in the letter's opening lines, which she could not help but glimpse as she unfolded it, caught her the way a soft plank catches a careful hand, and she read on by the last gray light through the cracked window. and what she found there would occupy her thoughts and her patient, careful attention for many weeks to come. Obadiah Marsh wrote to his daughter Verity as a man who believed, correctly as it turned out, that he would not live to explain himself to her in person. He wrote that he had built the Millrace Landing ferry crossing with his own hands in 1841, and that in the years since, he had organized among the river's boatmen and ferry hands, much as Willa's own father would later come to know in a more modest way further downstream, a shared fund the men themselves called the Common Purse, into which every waterman working that stretch of the canal contributed a small portion of his earnings, meant to support any boatman injured in the course of his work, or the widow and children of any man the river claimed outright. A genuine and carefully tended cooperative that had, by Obadiah's own account, grown over 6 years to a considerable sum held in trust for exactly the kind of hardship the river visited on its workers with grim regularity. Obadiah had administered this fund faithfully and alone for its first several years, but as the ferry crossings business grew and his own health began to fail, he had accepted the help of a younger, ambitious boatman named Silas Tuck, giving him joint custody of the Common Purse's ledger and its accumulated silver, believing, as Obadiah wrote with evident bitterness even so many years later, that a man eager to help was the same as a man worthy of trust. Within 2 years, Obadiah's letter continued. He had begun to notice discrepancies in the Common Purse's accounting that Silas always explained away as clerical error or unavoidable loan against future contributions, explanations Obadiah had at first accepted out of the same trust that had led him to share the fund's custody in the first place. It was only when a boatman badly injured in a boiler accident came to the fund for the relief he was plainly entitled to and was quietly turned away by Silas Tuck, citing insufficient reserves, that Obadiah began to suspect what his own letter now stated plainly, that Silas had been steadily diverting the Common Purse's silver into his own private ventures, building, silver by silver, the very fortune that would eventually let him purchase controlling interest in the ferry crossing itself once. Obadiah's declining health forced a sale. When Obadiah confronted him directly, Silas had responded, with a speed and confidence that told Obadiah everything about how carefully this moment had been anticipated, by accusing Obadiah himself of mismanaging the fund for years, a charge that gained immediate traction in a town more inclined to trust an ambitious young partner's confident word than an aging ferry keeper's increasingly desperate protests. Obadiah, his health failing and his name already turning to mud around the landing, had removed what remained of the Common Purse's silver before Silas could claim the rest of it, intending to safeguard it until he could gather proof enough to clear his own name, and had hidden it, his letter specified, with the same careful, deliberate hand throughout, beneath the flat hearthstone of the very chimney, whose masonry now stood not 3 feet from where Willa sat reading his words. He had planned, he wrote, to return for it once his health allowed and his name was cleared. He never had the chance. The letter's final lines, written in a hand grown visibly weaker, asked whatever daughter or descendant might one day find this letter to forgive an old man for leaving so much unresolved, and to see, if it could still be managed after however many years had passed, that the Common Purse silver reached the boatmen's families it had always been meant for, rather than the family that had stolen it. If you're enjoying this journey so far, we'd love to have you as part of our community. Take a moment to subscribe. It's completely free, and it helps us continue bringing these forgotten stories back to life. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Willa's position? Would you have kept the discovery to yourself, or fought to uncover the truth no matter the cost? We read every comment, and we love hearing your thoughts. Now, let's continue the story. Willa sat with that letter until well past dark, holding 40 years of a dead man's unfinished business in her 2 hands, and thought of her father kneeling beside some half-rotted hull, pressing his palm flat against the planking. Water finds every weakness eventually, and so does trouble if you give it time enough. Obadiah Marsh had found his own trouble exactly where her father would have predicted, in a partner too eagerly trusted with a fund too easily reached, and Willa understood, with a clarity that felt almost like her father's hand closing over her own, why the name Tuck had struck something uneasy in her from the very first months of her own marriage into that family's long orbit, decades before she had any concrete reason to distrust them. She did not act rashly, for she understood, from her own bitter and recent experience with Elam's forged dissolution paper, exactly how little a plain accusation would accomplish against a family that had held the ferry crossing and the town's easy trust for 3 generations running. She spent the following weeks in quiet, careful work, first confirming through the county's old land and probate records that Silas Tuck had indeed purchased his controlling interest in the Millrace Landing ferry in the very years Obadiah's letter described, a purchase price that, cross-referenced against what little remained of the era's public records, corresponded almost precisely to the silver Obadiah claimed had gone missing from the common purse. She traced, too, through careful inquiry among the oldest boatmen still living along that stretch of river, men now well into their 70s who remembered, however dimly, an old story about a ferry keeper accused of mismanaging a common fund, a story most of them had simply accepted at face value for lack of any reason to question it. Exactly as the town had once accepted Elam's dissolution paper against Willa herself. It did not take long for Elam Tuck to hear that the widow he had evicted from her home was now living in the old ferry house and asking pointed, careful questions about his own grandfather's history, and his reaction, once he understood the direction of her inquiries, carried none of the easy, grieving warmth he had shown while producing his forged paper against her. He came to the old ferry house himself, one gray afternoon, and offered, with a smoothness that reminded Willa uncomfortably of exactly how convincingly he had once presented his false dissolution agreement to the circuit judge, to purchase the ruined building back from her at several times what she had paid, citing sentimental interest in the town's ferry history now that the crossing's newer keeper's cottage needed expansion. Willa, who had spent 20 years reading small discrepancies out of her husband's ledgers, and knew precisely what a convenient offer sounded like when it arrived wrapped in false warmth, declined with a courtesy that revealed nothing of what she had already found. His tone shifted considerably once refused. Within days, word moved through Millrace Landing that the widow Bracken had been discovered removing materials from a county auction property without proper authorization, an accusation vague enough to trouble the sheriff without ever quite resolving into a formal charge, and separately, several of the boatmen Willa had spoken with about the old common purse story found their own small dealings with the ferry crossing, licenses and berth assignments controlled entirely by Elam, growing suddenly more difficult, a pressure applied quietly enough that no one could point to any single unfair act, but plainly enough that most of them grew reluctant to speak further with the widow at the old ferry house. For a hard stretch of weeks, Willa found herself exactly where a woman uncovering an old, inconvenient truth so often finds herself, alone, doubted, and facing a family with 3 generations of standing arrayed against her single carpetbag and a dead man's brittle letter. But she had, after all, spent her whole life learning that the soft place in any claim reveals itself eventually to a patient hand, and she understood that Obadiah's letter, however moving, would need more than sentiment to survive contact with a family determined to protect its fortune. She wrote first to whatever descendants of Verity Marsh might still be found and traced, through a series of careful letters to county offices upriver, a granddaughter of Obadiah's named Prudence Marsh Ellery, living now in a town some 60 miles distant, who had grown up hearing only her own family's private insistence that her grandfather had been wrongly accused of something no one in the family could ever fully explain, and who responded to Willa's careful account with an emotion that told. Willa she had found, at last, someone with as much reason as herself to see the matter through properly. She approached, next, the editor of the regional river trade newspaper that circulated among the towns along that stretch of the canal, a man with no particular loyalty to the Tuck family and a professional interest in a genuinely remarkable story of old river history, who agreed to examine Obadiah's letter and the land records himself before committing to anything, and who came away convinced enough to begin his own careful inquiries. And she returned, with fresh evidence now in hand, to the older boatmen who had first spoken with her, several of whom, once shown Obadiah's own letter in his own hand, found their courage considerably steadied against whatever quiet pressure Elam Tuck's control of the crossing could still apply. The newspaper's eventual story, running under a headline recalling the town's long-forgotten first ferry keeper and the fund he had died trying to protect, could not be dismissed the way Elam plainly hoped it would be, for it arrived supported by Obadiah's own letter, by his granddaughter's independent family testimony, and by land records any citizen of the county could examine for themselves at the courthouse. Public attention, once roused, proved considerably harder for the Tuck family to manage than a single widow's private accusation had been, and the county's River Commission, its interest sharpened by the newspaper's inquiries, and by several old boatmen, now openly recalling their grandfather's unspoken doubts about how quickly the Tuck family fortune had grown in those long-ago years, opened a formal review of the ferry crossing's original transfer of ownership. Silas Tuck himself had been dead for decades and could face no personal accounting. But the review concluded, based on the surviving records and Obadiah's detailed letter, that the crossing's original purchase had indeed been financed through funds diverted from the common purse, a finding that could not undo 4 decades of ownership, but that thoroughly and publicly unraveled the story of quiet, respectable success the Tuck family had told about itself for 3 generations. Elam Tuck's own forged dissolution paper against Willa came under fresh and immediate scrutiny once the newspaper's inquiries turned toward the family's broader pattern of convenient documents appearing at convenient moments, and a handwriting examiner engaged from Charleston found Thaddeus's supposed signature on the dissolution agreement considerably less convincing than the circuit judge had originally judged it to be, especially once compared directly against 2 decades of genuine signatures preserved in Willa's own carefully kept ledgers. Faced with the near certainty of a formal fraud charge that the newspaper's continued attention made politically impossible for the county to simply ignore, Elam agreed to a quiet settlement restoring Willa's rightful half-interest in the ferry crossing's value, paid out in full rather than risk a public trial that would have laid his family's entire history open to exactly the kind of scrutiny it could no longer survive. Willa did not ask for more than what was rightfully hers, but she did not stop at simple restitution either. Working alongside Obadiah's granddaughter Prudence, she used the Hearthstone silver, remarkably well preserved after more than 40 years in its dry hiding place, along with her own restored share of the ferry's value, to re-establish the common purse exactly as Obadiah Marsh had first conceived it, a genuine cooperative fund for the boatmen and ferry workers of that stretch of the canal, administered now by a small committee of working watermen rather than any single keeper, with accounts kept open for any contributor to examine at will. Precisely the safeguard Obadiah's own trusting arrangement with Silas Tuck had so painfully lacked. The old ferry house itself, the ruin she had bought for $9 because nothing else in the world was left to her, she repaired plank by careful plank with her father's old level always close at hand and turned it, in time, into a modest way station for boatmen between runs, a place where a man could find a hot meal and a dry bed, and, should the river ever deal him the hard hand it dealt so many, a fund that would actually be there to catch him. And so it was that Willa Bracken, 45 years old, cast out by a forged partnership paper and left with $11 and a carpet bag, became the reason a ferry keeper dead more than 40 years finally had his name restored, and a fund built to catch the river's poorest workers was finally given back its honest purpose. The ferry house that no one at that county auction had thought worth a single further bid had held, sealed in its rafters, not merely an old man's silver, but 4 decades of patient, unfinished truth, waiting only for a hand careful enough to press against the right soft place and find it. Willa had inherited her father's gift for feeling out the weakness beneath a confident surface, and it had cost her a marriage's worth of security before it finally gave back, not to her alone, but to every boatman and ferry hand on that stretch of the canal, a debt owed since 1847 and a good name restored to a family who had waited 2 generations to hear it spoken plainly. Nobody had bid on the weathered ferry house. It would turn out the house, and the truth it had been quietly guarding in its rafters all those years, had simply been waiting for the one person patient enough to press her palm against the ceiling and feel what lay hidden just beneath. We tell you Willa's story not merely because a hidden letter and a hearthstone of old silver make for a satisfying discovery, though they certainly do, but because of what she chose to do once that discovery was entirely hers to keep or to share. She could have taken the silver quietly, repaired her own modest home, and said nothing further of Obadiah Marsh's letter at all, and given everything that had been taken from her, few in her position could have been blamed for choosing exactly that. Instead, she spent her hard-won evidence clearing a stranger's 40-year-old name and rebuilding, from a ruined ferry house nobody wanted, a fund meant to catch the very kind of hardship that had so recently threatened to swallow her whole. That choice, more than the ferry house, more than the letter, more than the $9 that started it all, is the true inheritance of this story. The understanding that the soft place beneath a confident lie is always there for a patient hand to find, and that the smallest, most overlooked shelter can still, given time and care, become exactly the thing an entire river community was quietly waiting for. Thank you for spending this time with us. If Willa's story touched your heart, inspired you, or reminded you that truth has a way of revealing itself, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves unforgettable historical stories. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. What lesson from Willa's journey will stay with you the longest? Your thoughts help keep these conversations alive, and we read every one of them. Until our next story, remember this: history is filled with ordinary people whose quiet courage changed the world, and many of their stories are still waiting to be told. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.